Life often presents unforeseen circumstances. Sometimes, we find ourselves caught in moments that blur the lines between right and wrong, not by choice, but by the quiet force of fate. Have you ever felt as though the universe had a perverse sense of humor, singling you out for an elaborate, cosmic jest? That was precisely how I felt on that peculiar day. As if I had stumbled into a carefully woven plot that I had no control over. It began on an unremarkable Saturday afternoon, the kind of day that slips by unnoticed. Folding into the rhythm of routine. There was nothing extraordinary about it. The sky was overcast but not ominous, the air neither warm nor cold, just neutral. As if nature itself had chosen to remain indifferent. Inside my modest apartment, silence reigned, save for the gentle hum of the dryer. The rhythmic sound blended with the occasional rustling of fabric as I sorted through my closet, determined to declutter. It was a ritual I performed every so often. Donating what no longer served me, a small, almost subconscious act of renewal. That was when I found it. Tucked away beneath layers of forgotten garments, it lay there, an old miniskirt. Its fabric a whisper from a different time. I hadn't seen it in years, hadn't even remembered owning it. My fingers traced the delicate stitching as a flood of memories surged forward. Unbidden yet vivid. It was more than just a piece of clothing, it was a fragment of my past, a relic from a time when my confidence was effortless, my laughter unrestrained. And the world seemed to stretch endlessly before me, filled with nothing but possibilities. I had outgrown that version of myself, or so I had believed. Life had molded me into someone different. Someone who made pragmatic choices, who erred on the side of caution. The miniskirt belonged to a girl who lived freely, who embraced adventure without overanalyzing consequences. I was no longer her. Or was I? As I stood there, holding the skirt against me, a thought took root in my mind, subtle at first, then persistent. What if I wore it again? Just once. Not to reclaim the past, but to test whether remnants of that carefree spirit still lingered within me. I turned towards the mirror, hesitating before slipping into the fabric. It fit, though differently than before. Not in size, but in meaning. Staring at my reflection, I searched for something familiar, something I feared I had lost along the way. And that was when everything changed. The knock at the door shattered the moment, jolting me from my reverie. It was unexpected, no one was supposed to visit. My heart gave a small, inexplicable flutter as I walked toward the door. A sense of anticipation threading through me. I had no inkling then. But that knock was the beginning of something I could never have foreseen, an encounter that would challenge everything I thought I knew about myself. It was an impulsive decision. The kind that sneaks up on you when nostalgia weaves its way into the present. I pulled the dress from the back of my closet, its fabric slightly faded but still carrying the echoes of another time. As I slipped it over my frame, it fit more snugly than I remembered, clinging in places that once had more room, stretching over curves that time had subtly reshaped. The mirror reflected a version of me that was both familiar and foreign. I chuckled, a mix of amusement and self-consciousness settling in my chest. Just as I was adjusting the hem, a sharp knock on the door broke my reverie. I stiffened. Who could that be? I hadn't expected company. A brief wave of panic surged through me as I glanced at my reflection once more, hair tousled from an afternoon spent in quiet solitude, my attire an odd mix of nostalgia and casual disarray. The knock came again, firmer this time. Brushing aside my hesitation, I moved toward the door, schooling my features into nonchalance before swinging it open. There, standing on my porch, was Daniel. For a moment, I simply stared. My nephew was no longer the lanky, awkward teenager I had last seen so vividly in my memory. Instead, before me stood a young man of 22. His once boyish frame filled out with quiet strength. His broad shoulders squared, his stance easy yet confident. He had always carried a certain lightness about him. But now it was tempered by a calm composure that hinted at the passage of time. In his hands, a worn tool bag dangled casually, the faded leather handle curled under his grip. His signature easygoing smile played at the corners of his lips as he tilted his head slightly. "Auntie, you called about the leaky faucet." For a split second, my mind went blank. The faucet. Of course. I had called him earlier in the week, asking if he could take a look at the stubborn leak in the guest bathroom. And then, as the days had gone by, the thought had drifted from my mind like a passing cloud. Recovering quickly, I let out a short, self-deprecating laugh. Right. Yes, I did. It must have slipped my mind. A flicker of embarrassment threatened to creep in at my attire, an old dress, a reflection of another time, but I chose to ignore it. Instead, I stepped aside, gesturing for him to enter. The bathroom is down the hall, I said, my voice lighter now, amused by my own absent-mindedness. Daniel nodded, stepping in with an air of familiarity. As he moved past me, I caught the faintest scent of worn leather and fresh pine, the kind of scent that clung to someone who spent their time working with their hands. As I closed the door behind him, I exhaled softly, a small smile playing on my lips. Time was an odd thing. It shifted and stretched, carrying people forward, reshaping them into versions of themselves that both surprised and reassured. And as I watched my nephew set down his tools, rolling up his sleeves with quiet efficiency, I couldn't help but wonder how much had I changed in his eyes. As Daniel walked past me, I noticed a brief hesitation, his gaze flickering toward me before swiftly averting. It was fleeting, almost imperceptible, but something about it felt deliberate. Perhaps it was merely my imagination. A trick of the dim afternoon light filtering through the curtains. And yet, an unusual atmosphere hung in the air, subtle but undeniable. Daniel commenced his work while I returned to my closet, sifting through a few items I had set aside earlier. Despite my attempts to focus, I couldn't shake the odd tension lingering in the space. Have you ever felt someone's gaze on you? Even when they try to be discreet? That quiet, almost imperceptible awareness that someone is watching? At first, I dismissed it as overthinking. He was my nephew, after all. There was no reason to dwell on it. Yet, as I made my way toward the kitchen, passing by the bathroom, his voice halted me. "Auntie, can you come here for a second? I need your help." Something in his tone, calm yet insistent, drew my attention. I stepped inside. He was crouched beside the sink, sleeves rolled up, exposing his tanned, muscular arms. His hands, strong and calloused, gripped a wrench firmly, his knuckles slightly whitened from exertion. He gestured toward the faucet with his other hand. "I think the pipe is stuck. Can you hold this while I try to loosen it?" Nodding, I moved closer, my fingers wrapping around the faucet. The bathroom was small, and before I realized it, we were nearly shoulder to shoulder. The faint scent of soap and warm skin lingered between us. I endeavored to ignore the proximity, to focus solely on the task at hand, but the heat radiating from his body was impossible to overlook. For a moment, there was only the sound of metal against metal, the slow creak of the pipe yielding under pressure. I glanced at him, intending only to check his progress. But that was when I saw it, his gaze, shifting toward me in brief but frequent intervals, as though searching for something. His brows furrowed slightly, an unreadable expression flickering across his face before he quickly averted his eyes. A subtle unease coiled in my stomach. Was it curiosity? A mere coincidence? Or was there something deeper lurking beneath the surface, something neither of us had yet acknowledged? I swallowed, willing myself to dismiss the thought, but the tension remained. Unspoken yet palpable, hovering between us like an uninvited guest. "Everything okay?" I asked, my voice deliberately light, breaking the stillness that had settled between us like an invisible veil. He hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, a pause so brief it could have been dismissed, yet unmistakable. Then, with practiced ease, he summoned his customary smile. But something about it felt different this time, like a picture slightly out of focus. "Yeah," he said, rolling his shoulders. "You're the expert, right?" I nodded. But the air between us felt charged in a way I couldn't quite define. There was no overt tension, no spoken words that crossed any boundaries. Yet something unsaid lingered in the quiet spaces between our sentences. He returned his attention to the pipe, his hands moving with familiar precision. The rhythmic clinking of metal against metal filled the silence, grounding us in the moment. After a few more minutes, he finally loosened the stubborn fixture. With a quiet grunt, he straightened up, wiping his hands on the thighs of his worn jeans. The motion was casual, effortless, yet it carried an underlying energy I couldn't ignore. "All done," he announced. "Should be as good as new." I exhaled softly, offering a polite smile. "Thank you." I kept my tone neutral, careful. He leaned against the counter, his eyes resting on me with an intensity that made my skin prickle. Not discomfort, something else. Something unreadable. "You know, Auntie, I don't think I've ever seen you wear something like that before." The words landed softly, but their weight was undeniable. A subtle shift in the atmosphere. My breath hitched, only for a second. My gaze instinctively dropped to the miniskirt hugging my hips, as if seeing it for the first time. The realization struck me all at once, the way the fabric clung, the way it accentuated rather than concealed. I felt the heat rise to my cheeks. "Oh, this." I let out a nervous laugh, tugging at the hem in a futile attempt to make it longer. "Just something I found in the back of my closet while sorting through donation piles." The explanation felt flimsy even as I said it. His lips quirked slightly, a flicker of amusement or curiosity passing through his expression before it smoothed over again. He didn't press further, but he didn't need to. The silence that followed was thick, humming with unspoken thoughts neither of us dared to voice. A fleeting moment stretched just a little too long before he finally pushed away from the counter. The shift in his posture signaling the conversation, whatever it was, had run its course. "Well," he said, his tone lighter now, more familiar. "Guess I'll get going. Let me know if the pipe acts up again." I nodded, grateful for the return to normalcy. "Will do." As he walked toward the door, he paused, hand on the frame. A moment's hesitation. Then, with a final glance over his shoulder, he was gone. I exhaled, unaware until that moment that I'd been holding my breath. Something had shifted between us, subtle yet undeniable. But whatever it was, neither of us was ready to name it. Daniel was silent for a beat longer than necessary before he smiled, except this time, it wasn't quite the same easygoing smile I was accustomed to. It was softer. Almost knowing, as if he had seen something in me that I had yet to recognize myself. "It suits you." A strange flutter stirred in my stomach, something small yet insistent. I dismissed it immediately. He was just being polite, nothing more. A simple compliment, no hidden meaning. And yet, something about the way he said it made the air feel heavier. As if there was an unsaid truth lingering between us. "Thanks, I suppose," I murmured, eager to escape the unexpected weight of the moment. My fingers curled slightly at my sides. A subconscious reaction to the inexplicable energy between us. I turned swiftly, stepping out of the bathroom and into the hallway, hoping that physical distance might help clear the muddled thoughts forming in my mind. I had barely taken a few steps when I heard his footsteps close behind. He wasn't leaving yet. Then, just as I reached the hallway, his voice stopped me again. "Auntie." The word froze me mid-step. There was something in his tone, hesitation, uncertainty. It wasn't just the usual casual way he called me that. My heart inexplicably picked up its pace, a strange contradiction to the rational part of me that insisted this was nothing. I turned slowly, meeting his gaze. "Yeah." His lips parted slightly as if he had something important to say, something that had been resting on the tip of his tongue, waiting for the right moment. But then, as if reconsidering, he exhaled a short, breathy laugh and shook his head. "Never mind. Forget I said anything." His voice was light, almost dismissive. But the flicker in his eyes betrayed something deeper. A thought unspoken. A truth unshared. And despite his words, despite his insistence that it was nothing, I knew better. I watched him for a moment longer, searching his expression for clues, but he had already put his guard back up. Whatever it was, whatever had made him pause, it remained just out of reach. Yet, I couldn't forget the way he looked at me, or the way his voice had wavered ever so slightly. The moment clung to me, refusing to fade, long after he had walked away. The night stretched on in quiet solitude, the soft hum of the television filling the dimly lit living room. I curled up on the couch, aimlessly flipping through channels. trying to drown out the lingering thoughts in my mind. The day had been unsettling in a way I couldn't quite place. I kept telling myself I was overthinking it, that I was making something out of nothing. After all, Daniel was family. And yet, something about the way he had looked at me earlier stuck with me. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but now, in the stillness of night, my mind replayed it over and over again. The way his gaze lingered just a second too long. The way his voice hesitated when he spoke to me, as if searching for the right words but never quite finding them. Then, my phone buzzed, the sudden vibration jolting me from my thoughts. I glanced down at the screen, my breath catching for a moment. A message from Daniel. "Hey Auntie, can I ask you something?" My thumb hovered over the screen. A strange sense of apprehension crept up my spine. Why was he messaging me now, at this hour? After a moment of hesitation, I typed back. "Of course. What's on your mind?" The response came almost immediately, as if he had been waiting, fingers poised over his keyboard. "I keep thinking about today, and you." A flutter of unease rippled through me. My stomach twisted. Though I couldn't quite name the feeling that settled there. I hesitated, my fingers barely brushing the screen before I finally settled on a neutral response. "I was just trying on some old clothes." The message was read instantly. The little typing indicator appeared, blinking for a few seconds, then vanished. A pause. Then, another set of 3 dots, only to disappear again. The silence between us, even through the digital space, felt heavy. Finally, his reply came. "You looked really good. I mean that." The air in the room seemed to shift. A sudden and inexplicable tension wrapping around me. My pulse quickened. I reread his words, once, twice, a dozen times, searching for hidden intent. Was it an innocent compliment? Or was there something deeper beneath the surface? And more importantly, why did I feel this strange, unwelcome mix of emotions rising within me? I swallowed, my fingers tightening around the phone. That was the moment I realized this was only the beginning.